And in this sixth panel, we will talk about poverty and inequalities, turning the tide. So the very first video we will show you is about the key policy recommendations from a T20 task force on social cohesion and on poverty. Let's hear that.
Agenda 2030 is at the crossroad of several policy areas. Since 2015, it has indicated the unsustainabilities of our world, of our model of consuming, of producing, of interacting with our planet. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic has certainly, on one side, hit dramatically and slowed down the progress towards the implementation of SDGs. But on the other side, it has also confirmed the importance of the implementation of Agenda 2030 and of SDGs, all SDGs, if we want really to build back better, a more sustainable world for everybody. G20 can lead by example. For example, G20 members can present and track and assess their SDG implementation plan, linking to the utilization of the additional resources which are liberated. Then there are several sectoral policy recommendations. The first is to link, obviously, additional resources which are liberated by initiative on debt or initiative like the one decided by IMF on the additional SDRs to the realization of SDGs and to use these resources as innovatively as possible and as close as possible to the level of implementation. Another sectorial recommendation is to set up a permanent joint thematic group on food. This could be composed by agriculture, finance, development and health ministers. Last recommendation is to boost investment in science, technology and innovation in low and middle income countries through establishing missions which are linked to SDGs implementation.
And now, Professor Boeri, I leave the floor to you because you are in conversation with the 2019 Nobel laureate in economic sciences, Esther Duflo. Welcome, Mrs. Duflo. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thanks.
Dear Esther, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, and let me say that we hope to have you soon in presence in Italy. Far from being a great leveler, the pandemic has increased inequalities worldwide. According to the World Bank, extreme poverty has increased by about 100 million. The ILO estimates that some 150 million jobs were lost. And also the main social elevator, the education system, has suffered a lot. The estimate is about 1.5 trillion hours of school being lost. And above all, the current recovery does not seem to be improving the situation. Actually, it may make the situation even worse, because yesterday we learned from the managing director of the IMF that we are experiencing a great divergence in economic performance, and that is making even worse the situation in the developing world, with an increase in food prices and also lagging behind in growth. So beyond the vaccination campaign, the acceleration of the vaccination campaign in developing world, what do you think can be done to tackle this emergency, this social emergency? One of the proposals that we developed in the task force I had the honor to co-chair was the introduction of a global universal basic income or citizenship income scheme for developing countries. So an unconditional cash transfer to be provided and funded largely by G20 countries. What do you think about this proposal? Is it feasible? Is it something that is desirable at this stage?
Yes, so first of all, I should say that I think the richer world has missed a massive opportunity to show a modicum of sense that there is a common planet in this pandemic in at least two circumstances, in at least two occasions. One is towards the beginning of the pandemic when the rich world started to borrow massive amounts of money in order to sustain their own economy. Trillions of dollars, with up to 20% of GDP and fiscal stimulus measures in the rich countries, but at the same time did not see it fit to find a little bit of money to cover something at least similar in the poorest country, such that the poorest country spent about 2% in fiscal stimulus measures during the pandemic. And that is kind of the root of the divergence that we are observing today, because the pandemic itself didn't strike disproportionately the poor countries at the beginning. In fact, anything but they had to adopt, because we didn't know what was going on, the similar kind of lockdown measure. And unlike the rich countries, they were unable to protect their citizens, which has started, a loop of poverty traps. One of them is the one you mentioned, which is the education gap, which even today is not really in process of being solved. As of today, there are still 130 million kids around the world who are not in school because of the pandemic. Most of the schools in India are yet to reopen after so many months. And this is something that very early in the pandemic, something like in May, we were calling with Abhijit Banerjee for a Marshall Plan towards the developing countries. And no one paid attention. And I was like, yes, this is, the rich countries are very busy with their own problems. That's not the right time. But then we renewed this appeal later around the G7 meeting in the UK. And again, nothing happened. And even now, the IMF leader goes around trying to make a similar request, and again, nothing happens. And this is quite remarkable to me, that we didn't see fit to show such basic solidarity, which would have cost almost nothing compared to what we were spending on ourselves. The second, of course, is vaccination. I know that this is not what you want to talk about, but it's worth mentioning. This would have been easy, this would have been cheap. The IMF estimates $50 billion. That we couldn't find this $50 billion, and that to these days we are unable to do that, means that now we have the added problem that the pandemic itself is going to have a disproportionate health impact in the poor countries, which is going to make it harder for them to restart their economy. So now we are on top of what we had before, which is we didn't have the same amount of fundings to sustain the economy. We have the pandemic. Now, coming back to your proposal, yes, I think it is feasible. In fact, what we were recommending in our book, which came out in the US in 2019, just before the pandemic, was universal, very basic income towards the poor countries, which would have been, and very similar to your proposal, a very small income sufficient to starvation, perhaps available when people request it. So this which would make it considerably cheaper if you just have a small request mechanism that you have to do to make sure that people access it when they need it. And it's always available in case of crisis, personal or global. The pandemic showed that having those systems in place ready, having the pipes in place with such a system ready, would have been tremendously helpful. Because one of the things that happened, even for countries which technically would have had the money to help their citizens during the lockdowns, is that they didn't have the ways to do it. Like in India, for example, the organization of the redistribution was completely messy. And that's why migrant workers had to go home to access their programs, because the only way that the government could do it is tied to your home address. Well, if there had been a universal, very basic income in place, connected to people's bank accounts or connected to people's cell phones, which many people have, for example, in Africa, then they would have been able to kind of ramp it up. Once you have the pipe in place, when you have a crisis, you can just put a bit more water into these pipes and help the economy continue to flow. So I think this is an excellent idea. I think it is feasible. I think it can. I have no hope that the rich countries would ever want to pay for it. But if they would, be my guest, that would be fantastic. Even if they wouldn't, I think we still need to do it, because then the poor countries would actually be able to finance a good part of it from their own tax revenues as they finance most of their social programs today, as long as it is kept small and available in crisis periods.
So even if I don't want to pay for it, we can make them to pay for it. Another proposal developed by our task force is introducing a tax on the stock market capitalization of publicly listed companies in the G20 country. This proposal has been in particular developed by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman. They propose to introduce a tax of about 0.2%, so it would seem to be a relatively modest tax, but would still raise some 200 billion that could be used also to fund such a universal basic income scheme. What do you think about this additional proposal of our task force?
I think it's a great idea, and I think, I always want to think of the glass being as half full, and I think in a way this is probably a good moment for such a proposal, because one of the, when you try to convince either citizens or their leaders that we need to show a bit more generosity towards the poor countries, there is always the answer is, oh, the money is not going to be used effectively, and there is corruption, and so on and so forth. But I think now, especially with the pandemic, people realize that it is actually completely technologically feasible to have a system of cash transfer that is directly going to people's pockets, that those systems are fairly robust. A country like Togo, which is a very small country, managed to put it together for their citizens within weeks of the pandemic started. And Togo is one place where lockdowns were put in place regularly when they needed them, and where in fact the health burden of the pandemic was much less, as well as the economic burden. So if Togo can do it, Togo is now in a position to expand it in the rest of the region with a system that is effective, that is efficient. Once it is expanded to the rest of the region from Togo, I think it would be a powerful example that, look, the way to spend this money that Saez and Zuckman wants to raise is there. And it is a way that is effective, that is pretty much corruption-proof, that has shown in multiple studies to provide immediate benefit to the people in period of crisis. So let's just go and do it. So there might be, everything is in place for at least the rhetorical objection to such a proposal to be removed. Now, it's not sufficient because, going back to vaccination, all the rhetorical objections to vaccinating the world are removed. Everybody agrees it's a good idea. And for a reason that I still don't understand, that doesn't seem to be possible. So here as well, we are going to find something. Something's going to happen. Very serious people are going to stand in the way, or some political obstructionists of some kind of the other. But, there is at least a glimmer of hope that it is feasible, because the money is not that much. The system can be put in place. We can have convincing use cases and move forward from there. So I have some hope that it could get done.
Thank you so much, Esther.
Very interesting,
Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mrs. Duflo, Professor Duflo. Thanks. Maybe she can stay with us for a little bit longer, but meanwhile, a new pattern also for the working environment is put in place after the pandemic with this remote working. It's going to be like the new normal, or it's going to change a little bit? It's going to be managed in a different way? What do you think?
I don't think it's going to be a new normal. Certainly, remote working, as I would call it, has increased in all countries. It was about 10% of the workforce involved before the pandemic, and it rose about 40-50% during the crisis. Nowadays it's going down, and more work is done in presence. Still, I think we are not going to the level that were prevailing before. As many firms also coming out of a crisis being highly indebted are trying to cut on fixed costs. So I think we are going to move to a hybrid condition in which workers will be in presence for 3 days a week and 2 days at home or something like that. And this creates a number of opportunities as well as problems. The opportunities are that we are going to reduce somewhat traffic and related pollution, reducing work injuries that often takes place in the transit from home to work. Also, greater well-being, possibly for people being more able to manage their time. But at the same time, there are issues. This is a highly unregulated area involving many also cross-border flows because remote working can be done everywhere. And also, I think, and this is my main concern, it could increase inequalities and create even more barriers to social mobility because you add the new dimension of inequality, notably housing inequality, to working inequality. You know, people living in poor residential environment will find it very hard to cope with this. People having poor internet connection will also be penalized with respect to other workers. So that's something we really have to deal with. And unfortunately, the problem is that we don't have a good monitoring system. There is no survey in countries, you know, OECD countries, tracking at the same time working conditions, salary, wages, careers of workers, and housing conditions. So we need to know more about this.
It's going to be evolving into something else, and we still have to know how. Let me start the conversation and the panel here with Karim El Ainaoui, President, Policy Center for the New South in Morocco, Gabriela Bucha, Executive Director for Oxfam International, welcome, and Guntram Wolf, Director of Bruegel in Belgium. Thank you to the three of you for being with us today. Can you hear me well, right? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. El Ainaoui, I start with you. The pandemic has had this strong impact on the global economy. Hitting in particular, we have just seen that, the developing countries. In your view, what is the recipe for the global South to build economic resilience? You have 4 minutes for your reply.
Well, thank you. Nice to be with you. I cannot give you a recipe in 4 minutes, and even if you gave me hours, what I can give you is how sort of we reacted here in Africa, in Morocco, and other countries that I follow. Basically, the crisis showed the importance of to have a strong state in a positive sense, not an authoritarian state, but an organized state, a social state, able to deliver services and protection for its own population. So it was mentioned by Ms. Duflo earlier on. She gave the example of Togo. So it's a matter also of organization, of how you operate logistics, how you are able to bring services to the population, and particularly the poor portion of your population. So I think we are on for a sort of the state is back in a way. And this is a demand from population. This is not something that is superimposed. Let's not forget that the poor are sort of bearing the stronger part of the adjustment of mistakes in policies, inefficiency in policies, done by governments. They're not a symmetrical impact on population, so the poor are more affected. So it is a good case to correct with pro-poor policies, and that are sort of tailored for you to have, social cohesion. Social cohesion is a peaceful society with a sense of fairness a sense of justice, which we're all sort of attached to as human beings, without any sort of ideological component. And it's not easy to put in practice. We need to acknowledge that it's complex. Often policies do not acknowledge up front that it is complex. Academics may, but when it comes to delivering on the ground, often we have very simple mechanisms that just fail, and this links back to the social cohesion where you are mentioning. That's what I was. I mean, those countries need to work on the efficiency of the state, their fairness, their sort of transparency and governance, and capacity to be for the population to assess their effectiveness. So it has also, a flavor of course, democracy and a more open society, and which remains, I think, something even more important today.
Thank you. I agree with you. Mrs. Bucher, what about, 2030 will be a milestone for the global development agenda. As far as the SDGs are concerned, are you confident the objectives will going to be reached?
Thank you, and thank you very much for having Oxfam here at this important event. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, so yes, I'm also very pleased that we're focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals, their roadmap for humanity, and all our governments and every G20 government has signed up to them, and they represent our collective hope. But the reality is that we were far off track before the pandemic struck, and now we're mostly free-falling backwards. So the status of SDG 1, hundreds of millions pushed into poverty. SDG 2, unfortunately, 11 lives every minute likely being lost to hunger. And on SDG 4 and 5, 20 million girls may never return to school. And we can go on. But yet the challenge facing the SDGs is not a lack of resources. And I think Professor Duflo was saying how some of these solutions are affordable. It's not a lack of talent, because actually we have plenty of talent, plenty of imagination right across the world. The challenge is that our economic rules are designed to serve the interests of a tiny few at the expense of opportunities for so many. So this is what SDG 10 is all about. SDG 10 is about reducing inequality, and it is critical in making progress across all goals. But as we have been hearing, inequality is getting even more extreme. We know a billionaire recently burned $5 billion on a joyride to space, but the whole world struggled to find $5 billion to fund education for those millions of kids that are most at risk of being left behind. And we know the global economy has put tens of billions of dollars into the profits, into the vaccine monopoly owners, while billions of people are being denied access to a vaccine. So we do think we have to come together to do better. And we know that the G20 is our best chance at leadership on the global stage to get this right. If we were to assess the performance of the G20 amid the biggest crisis in a generation, at a time in which millions of lives have been lost, what would we say? Perhaps we would say what has been done is insufficient. We value the progress, for example, on the issuance of SDRs. But a number of the issues that we are discussing today, we need to really see much more than we have up to now. The good news is that G20 can change this, and they have a chance to show they did what was necessary in Rome on October 20th. The single most important step at the G20 must be to listen to their own members, South Africa, Indonesia, India, and really call for the intellectual property rules on COVID-19 vaccines to be lifted at the WTO, and for technology to be transferred to the World Health Organization. We need to see an end to the opposition of Germany and the UK to the waiver, and provide the turning point to the pandemic that saves millions of lives and gives a chance to address this inequality that we've talked about. That's how we unlock vaccine supplies across the globe and get the economy running again. That's the first step, but not the only step. The G20 has an immensely historic decision to make on the global corporate tax deal. The deal we currently have, the version we have as proposed by the G7, is frankly being seized by a handful of rich nations. Instead, we need a deal with at least a 25% minimum corporate tax rate as proposed by tax experts, so that we can invest in schools, in nurses, in transforming people's lives and achieving the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Booker. You touched a lot of points, and I so agree with you with so many points you've touched. Very important to say that. Mr. Wolf, a major achievement of Italy in the recent G20 was like this establishment of a global minimum tax. Well, it's already in theory. We have to see that in practice still. Do you think with taxation, it's possible to use taxation like sort of a leverage in order to do more on the inequalities front?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I was planning to say a few words following up on what Esther Duflo was talking about, namely the question of pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, where, frankly speaking, I quite share Esther's pessimism or I would say analytical description of reality. And where I wanted to put the focus on the future. In fact, we know that in the current pandemic, the rich world missed a huge opportunity to accelerate the vaccination of the world and to ensure that vaccines become widely available and quickly. I think the situation will probably improve in the next half year, because now the global capacity to produce significant amounts of vaccines is there. So there will be some improvement, but it comes quite late. Now, what I'm wondering is, what do we do with the next pandemic? And, I had the pleasure to work for a G20 panel that reported to the G20 finance ministers early July of this year. The high-level independent panel on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And, the basic argument we are making is that the likelihood of pandemics is actually increasing. It's not decreasing, it's increasing. It's increasing because of a loss of biodiversity, because of climate change, because of increasing closeness between humans and nature due to the loss of major areas of natural habitat. So this likelihood is increasing, and frankly speaking, it is irresponsible not to invest in pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And we computed estimates of what it would take to significantly reduce the probability of such pandemics reoccurring. And it turns out the numbers are actually very small. The world might need something in the sort of below 15 billion US dollars per year. 15 billion US dollars is probably the best public investment with the highest return that exists at the moment. You would invest a double-digit billion number in US dollars, and the return you receive from that is in the hundreds, not only in the hundreds of billions, but in the 100 times the investment. So meaning you will literally save trillions of US dollars. So it is actually irrational not to do these kind of investments. It's not just morally unfair and morally unacceptable. It is actually economically irrational not to invest it. And that leaves us with a puzzle. I have to say, this discussion is, of course, still ongoing. The G20 countries are discussing and want to raise some money, but the first signals we are getting from these ongoing political discussions is that we probably will fall short of what is needed in pandemic prevention for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And I think this really bodes well, bodes badly for providing global public goods in general. I mean, this is really an easy global public good to provide. I mean, it takes double-digit billions. It's very cheap, this global public good, and that contrasts very much with I would say, climate change, where providing climate change is actually very difficult because it costs a lot of money to do the necessary investments, etc., etc. So I can understand why countries are free riding on climate change issues. I mean, I don't approve it, but I can understand it. But I can't really understand why the world is not managing to mobilize the 10 to 15 billion that we estimate will be needed to reduce the likelihood of such pandemics in the future.
Perfect. Mr. Wolf, you have used already 4 minutes to comment on Esther Duflo. If you want, you can use 3 minutes to answer my question about taxation.
Oh, okay. So
it's all right. Yeah. Go on.
I'm happy to talk about many different issues. So I can, of course, also talk about the taxation
Thank
issue.
you.
I mean, look, my take on this is that we are way behind where we should be on ensuring that tax avoidance really gets addressed, and companies as well as individuals pay their fair share of taxes. And if you look at the release of, it was this week, I think, of the Pandora Papers. I mean, it's just a totally unacceptable a system where just way too many rich individuals evade proper taxation, and so this needs to be addressed. And I personally think it's a huge success if the OECD G20 processes lead to a step forward, and we ensure that there's a corporate minimum tax around the world. Now, this deal isn't closed yet, right? I mean, it's still ongoing, the negotiations, but I understand that countries like such as Ireland are now ready to move up their corporate tax to 15%, given where we are and where the pressure is on. So that would be a success, definitely. But in a sense, I do think there is an issue that goes beyond the corporate side. It's also some of the individuals that evade taxes, where there are still some tax havens, and definitely in a system where the share of capital income is actually increasing. It is very important that the taxation base doesn't only rest on value-added taxes and labor taxes. I mean, and if you look at the trends, I mean, what you see in many European countries, for example, is you see a fairly stable share of capital income tax, but the capital income as a share of value added has actually been increasing, meaning effectively the average taxation of the corporate sector of capital income has fallen. So I think there is a need to rebalance that. And I'm very happy if some progress is being made on this, but I think this will be a continued negotiation and discussion.
Thank you. Mrs. Bucher, you also have 3 minutes for this reply. You said before, G20 meeting in Rome is critical, it's very important. What do you think the role of G20 should be in order to finance policies, for example, to reduce inequality?
Yes, thank you. So, as was said before, we need to increase the fiscal space so that countries are able to invest in the policies that are going to make any difference on people's lives and, of course, achieve the SDGs. So the corporate tax deal that is for discussion in Rome is this one of these key elements. And at the moment, the version that we have is not really an overhaul as we would like it to be, and it's not the historic deal that we could have hoped for. Only 100 corporations will be covered, while the financial sector is exempted from the deal. And most shockingly, 2/3 of all the revenue would be granted to mainly G7 and EU nations. So the poorest countries, despite being key markets in which sales are made for corporations, and despite being home to a third or more than a third of the world's population, will get less than 3% of these revenues as a result of the way the deal is being discussed. And we also need to see a change to that minimum corporate tax rate. So my predecessor was speaking of Ireland going up to 15%. 15% is a bare minimum and is basically in line with tax havens such as Singapore. So it would be normalizing that approach. We need a minimum of 25%. And as we know, after the Second World War, which was a similar massive shock to the system in the United States, we had rates of over 40 to 50% corporate tax rates that stayed on for some time because that was required in terms of investment. So if we reach 25% at this time, that would raise nearly 17 billion more per year for the world's poorest countries than a 15% rate. And imagine what that would mean in terms of investment for a woman, a street seller in Uganda, a nurse in Nepal, small businesses. So that is what many developing countries and G20 countries such as Argentina are calling for. But even that would only be a start. And that was being mentioned before, the Pandora Papers demonstrate the enormous amount of tax avoidance. And that's where the money is flowing around in the darkness of the world's tax havens. And that's where we're missing all our hospitals, all the payments for teachers, for firefighters, for public servants. So we can no longer, nobody can say that there is no money. The money is there, it's just in the wrong places. So we have an opportunity at G20 to really work on that corporate tax deal and really make it an end of tax havens. And also on the G20 agenda is, of course, the issue of special drawing rights, which is important, as I mentioned before, another element of the fiscal space that is required. At the moment, of course, of the 650 billion, 400 billion would be going to rich countries because of the way the system is allocated in terms of each member country's quota in the IMF. So Italy and Tanzania may have the same size population, but Italy gets nearly 40 times more or $20 billion more than Tanzania. So we need to see a significant portion, at least $100 billion of SDRs redirected to where they're most needed, to low and middle-income countries. And we need to ensure that debt and conditionality free, because that would mean that they would actually be able to be used properly. France recently committed 20% of its SDRs, around $5.5 billion to Africa. And we think this is a very positive step that shows that it can be done. And the G20, we feel, must do its part to secure strong and fair, channeling ambition from other wealthy countries and get this to be the norm. Thank you.
Thanks, Mrs. Bucher. And Mr. Elanawi, what about empowering women? Because I have such a privileged panel to interview. I like to have your view also on this. Coming here, I read a statistic in the stock exchange in London. There are more CEOs named Peter than CEO who are women. So it was like, my God. And in Italy too. I mean, more CEOs named Carlo in Italian stock exchange than CEO who are women. But women are important to boost equitable growth, especially in Africa, in Afghanistan, in many places in the world. What can we say about that in reducing this gender gap? You have to put your mic on.
Yeah, what I hear the picture you're describing, which is what we have today in many places. What I can tell you is that, as I'm also a dean at the university, is that we have 70% of our students here in Morocco are women. For a reason we don't understand very well, it would be maybe too long to explain here. In many higher education, it's about 70 to 75% women. So this will bring about transformational change in the upcoming generation. I can be optimistic on this basis. But again, I think, and it's like the discussion I was listening, you just had before. There's politics. I mean, economists, we tend to think in a sort of equilibria, sort of framework and apolitical systems. Politics is back. Geopolitics is back. I think what we lived, since the 90s is a parenthesis. So aid the notion that there are rich countries and poor countries, I don't think would be as relevant as we may think. There's rivalry. Countries will be invited to take sides. You can all feel that. So going back to that, women also is a political matter, is an institutional matter. So I think we can only be very concrete on those things. It's not about proclamation. It's about institutions. It's about objective. It's about measuring. It's about progress. It's about, budgets. It's about investing for it to transform. I can give you a conundrum here in Morocco, for instance. With urbanization, we have lower participation of women to the labor market. You thought that urbanization is education, is a participation to the labor market. We've observed, over the past 15 years that women labor participation rates have declined. There are explanations, reservation wage, why women would stay home, etc. But this is a worrisome trend. So I think education and institutions and having concrete policy with measurement and having open debates again to show up trade-offs between policies and choices, and that's what we do in think tanks, in academia, is to show options, and I think not to go also to way beyond what we are able to do, which is goals, has to do with politics. And I think one lesson of this COVID crisis is that also the role of science, the nexus, academia, science, policies, and population, is something very complex. We've seen it, over the past couple of years. So I think in academia, think tanks and institutions of this nature, we need to see how we can improve the functioning of this very complex nexus for to contribute to show options again of policies, and to show inconsistency, to show sort of crazy situation like Guntram was describing. It doesn't make sense because it goes in no one's pocket, Guntram. It's not, you don't have an identified investors that will have returns. Maybe we need to innovate. It could be it could be sort of financialized, where the financial sector invests in this sort of global goods with the return. So I think we have a problem with finance also. We have not talked about that, but that creates many risks where the poor, in fact, are bearing the brunt of their crisis in the financial sector. And maybe my last word is that we never really recovered, in fact, from the financial crisis, and until this crisis, we have macroeconomic disequilibriums, we have issues of rich versus poor, just to summarize, etc. So the institutions are sort of lagging behind what's happening in reality. And the same to your question with women. I think this is lots of lip service. I mean, there's progress. Like in Morocco, we have imposed quota for women in the parliament. I mentioned in university where it's open, no barriers to entry, and then you see women entering. There's this conundrum with the labor market. So it's not enough just to have commitments to raise awareness, and I don't think it's good, but it's way not enough. And again, this is a long fight. I don't think this is something will happen overnight. This is a fight. This is something we need to work on.
Mrs. Bucher, can I have also your opinion on this issue about empowering women?
So maybe I would say that we need systemic solutions. So I think the SDGs are part of the answer. So instead of focusing on GDP, we need to focus on people's lives. And one element that is outside of GDP calculations that is fundamental and central to women's lives is the care economy. So making sure that is central in public policy is important, because there are all sorts of barriers for women's participation, and care burdens, and the valorization of care is a big important part of it. And another that I would say, Michelle Bachelet was mentioning earlier, is that when we think of investments, we must absolutely think about the intersectionality of identities and how different groups of people are differently impacted by policy, and to make sure that we have impact assessments and disaggregated data, and that we're really focusing on achieving results for those who have traditionally been left out of investments. So for women's participation in the economy and for women's participation in public life, we need to definitely focus initially also on girls and girls' education. And as I was saying in my initial answer, it's extremely concerning that now with the pandemic impact on education, there's a disproportionate effect on girls' education. And that is concerning now for those girls' lives now, but also for their future and their potential to participate in the economy in the future, and therefore for our development in general and long-term achievement of goals.
Yeah.
So it's about making investments now on girls, on adolescents, and making sure the care economy is part of the equation when we think of development.
I have a question from Ivana Zacharias from Suma in Chile to Mr. Wolf. Ivana writes, many leaders have suggested the implementation of inheritance taxes and wealth taxes to deal with the wide inequality that exists in many countries. However, when it comes to the poorest countries in the world, there might be a difficult solution to implement. What role for the G20 to advance universal solutions, Mr. Wolf? That's a question for you.
Well, I mean, inheritance taxes and wealth taxes, as you know, taxes are basically set at the national level, and different countries have different kinds of inheritance and wealth taxes. Belgium, for example, has a pretty significant inheritance tax. Other countries have lower inheritance taxes. Now, when it comes to low-income countries, I guess one key question is how can this inheritance tax, if a low-income country was to decide to implement an inheritance tax, how can it be actually implemented? I mean, because there comes back to the point we discussed before, which is all about tax evasion of those that are rich and can find different havens for parking their wealth. So you want to, I think you want to have a system where this kind of tax evasion and tax havens really gets reduced, and then it's also going to be easier to do the inheritance, to implement the inheritance taxes. Perhaps the last point on this, of course, what is also quite important, especially if you are a very low income country, is that the capital stock is being built up. Meaning, if you have a business that functions well, and at some stage that SME also goes to the children, you don't want to tax that so much that then this business gets destroyed. So there's also a very sort of careful balance you have to strike on exactly inheritance taxes and the buildup of capital, especially in low-income countries.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wolf, and thank you to all my guests.